Good morning and happy Wednesday. Welcome to the Carsey Policy Hour. I'm your host, Melinda Negron-Gonzalez. Each month, we gather to unpack a pressing policy issue shaping communities in New Hampshire and beyond. And today's topic, affordable housing, could not be more urgent. Over the past year, as you probably know, headlines across the state have highlighted record low vacancy rates, rising rents, and stalled development proposals, which are all contributing to a growing sense that New Hampshire is reaching a tipping point. Communities from the Seacoast to the Upper Valley are wrestling with the same questions, right? How does the state attract and retain workers when housing is out of reach? What tools do local governments actually have to address shortages, and what kinds of policies might truly make a difference? So today's conversation tackles these questions head on, and we're very lucky to be joined by Emmy Ham, the Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. But before we dive into today's talk, let's take care of some housekeeping. At the Carsey Policy Hour, our aim is not only to inform, but also to prompt meaningful discussion. And the Carsey School of Public Policy is independent and nonpartisan. The school is nationally recognized for rigorous and actionable research. We house 4 research centers at the Carsey School, and we also educate tomorrow's leaders through our professional master's programs offered both online and in person. And it's not too late to apply for a spring start for a master's program. I've got to get that in there. So do check out our website for more info on our research centers and graduate programs at the Carsey School. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our series partners for the Carsey Policy Hour. Our partners are the New Hampshire Municipal Association, New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training, the New England Sustainability Network, and the New Hampshire Association of Counties. Thank you for your support. Following the presentation this morning, we'll open the floor to questions and discussion, so please do feel free to submit comments and questions during the presentation using the chat feature. And you'll find the chat button on the center left of your Teams screen. The chat is open and visible to everyone, so please do avoid inflammatory remarks and identify yourself in the chat when you offer remarks or pose questions. Okay, now I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker this morning. Emmy Ham is the Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. She works with municipalities, employers, and community groups to expand attainable housing options and strengthen the region's workforce. Emmy brings a wealth of experience in community engagement and local planning, and we are lucky to have her this morning, so I am going to turn this over to you, Emmy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Melinda. I really appreciate that. And good morning to everyone on the call. I see some familiar names out there. It's good to see you all. I just want to start by sharing how I got here in the first place, which is by way of UNH. So I was an undergrad in 2012. I started as a major in international affairs and anthropology, and I minored in French at the University of New Hampshire. That led me to study abroad for a semester in Aix-en-Provence, France. And upon graduating, I actually returned to France to teach English for a year, and so became somewhat proficient in French, so that when I returned and an affordable housing agency was looking for a French speaker to support their Francophone African populations coming in seeking housing, I was hired. And so that is how I found my way to affordable housing by way of language and language that I developed at the University of New Hampshire. So that was a really direct service role that I served in, speaking directly to applicants, to families and individuals who, were starting their lives in the United States. And it just showed me how transformative housing was in people's lives, but also in communities and economies. So that's how I found my way here. And I have just sort of fallen in love with this work. And I'm very proud now to be the director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. So with that, I'll start sharing my screen and dive in. So our organization, our mission is to engage and educate communities. Sorry, one moment, just getting my speaker view. Our mission is to educate and engage communities and municipalities to advance diverse housing options so that everyone who works in our region can also afford to call it home. And we do that primarily through 4 pillars. We call that. That's education. So this is an educational webinar that we're doing. It's a really great example. We also have events throughout the year. We provide education to municipal staff, elected leaders, local leaders, and the business community, also the general public. We provide technical assistance to planners, citizen planners who are volunteering on planning boards or housing committees. We provide engagement and advocacy efforts throughout the region to promote beneficial solutions at the state and local level. And we work on messaging as well. So we seek to change the conversation about housing in order to create a future where the importance of housing is really well understood and demystified. So that's our organization. So I wanted to start today's talk by digging into what's the problem. I think we all understand why housing is important and it's a challenge. But I want to dig a little bit deeper into the data that really shows us just how big of an issue it is right now. So just a couple weeks ago, we were fortunate to receive a presentation from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute at our Greater Seacoast Housing Summit, and got a really great snapshot, a data snapshot of where we are right now, both statewide and in the Seacoast. So as you can see, housing costs are really high in New Hampshire, and this is primarily due to low vacancy rates. This is really a clear supply and demand issue. New Hampshire housing defines a healthy rental vacancy rate to be around 5%, but recent rates for 2-bedroom units were as low as 0.6% in early 2003, which is really a strong indicator of a pretty severe housing shortage. Rates below 3 to 5% really reflect high demand, insufficient supply, and obviously result in increased cost, which you are seeing here. So the indicators that are used are median monthly rent and utility cost for a 2-bedroom apartment. And so you can see both statewide and in Rockingham and Strafford counties. Those are the 2 counties that we focus on in particular within our organization. And then within, particular municipalities like Rochester, Portsmouth, and Dover, there were increases across the board, pretty significant increases between 2015 and 2024, both in rent and in sale price of a median single family home. So compare that to overall inflation rates and to average hourly wage in New Hampshire, and then per capita personal income, you can see that the cost of housing is really outpacing all of those things quite significantly in New Hampshire and in particular localities as well. So this is another slide from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. Again, it's just showing that rental units have risen quite extensively statewide between 2018 and 2024. That is really in every single county. You can kind of see how just staggering those price differences are between in that time period. So what does the problem lead to? High housing costs really lead to quite a number of issues, both within our communities and in our economies. And I'm not going to get into every single one, but I wanted to just touch on a few here this morning. The first is inequity. So it's the Othering and Belonging Institute has a really amazing series called Deconstructing the Housing Crisis, where they go into depth on each of these outcomes of high housing costs. So I would encourage you to check that out if you have a moment. But I just want to briefly summarize sort of what they say and what we know to be true about all of these outcomes of high housing costs. With inequity, Black rates of home ownership peaked just before the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008 and have never fully recovered, while white homeownership has soared to record levels in recent years, even in spite of the affordable housing crisis. So this really explains the persistence of a racial wealth gap, which contributes to different rates of ownership by race. The other major result of high housing costs is evictions. The leading cause of evictions in New Hampshire, as in most states, is non-payment of rent. So families and individuals who just can't afford to make those rent payments every month. Other reasons include, violating lease terms, causing property damage, and just behaviors that threaten the safety and health of others. All of those of which fall under good cause eviction. But the leading cause, it's important to note, is non-payment of rent. And as we all know, evictions are associated with a host of really negative psychological consequences for families and children, and ultimately the community. And evictions often and sometimes lead to homelessness. So homelessness looks really different depending on where you are in the United States. But in New Hampshire, it is characterized by extreme temperatures. So we have, today is really cold here in New Hampshire. It was even colder yesterday. And then in the summertime, we have pretty extreme heat. We also have we do have a public transportation system, but it is not as robust as in more densely populated metropolitan areas. And so that makes it challenging for unhoused individuals to access resources. Unfortunately, in New Hampshire, we experienced an increase in homelessness during the most recent point in time count. According to the New Hampshire Coalition to End Homelessness, we experienced the highest percentage increase of any state in 2023, with a surge of 52.1% in the number of people experiencing homelessness in the state. In comparison to the national average of 12%, this is a concerning statistic. So these are some of the social implications of high housing costs. I now want to focus a little bit more on the economic implications. We are the Workforce Housing Coalition, and so we focus in particular on the health of our workforce and economy as it relates to housing. And so we really focus on these three outcomes, which is cost burden, workforce shortages, and sprawl. And so I'm going to get into each of these in a little bit more depth. So with cost burden, we use the United States Housing and Department of Housing and Urban Development definition of cost burden, which is a household that spends more than 30% of its income on housing expenses. So that could be rent and utilities, or it could be mortgage and utilities and insurance and taxes, depending on if you are a renter or a homeowner. But any household that is spending more than 30% of its income on those housing expenses is considered cost burdened. A household that spends over 50% of their household income on those housing costs is considered to be severely cost burdened. And so those are the two markers that we use, that 30% threshold and that 50% threshold. Affordability, of course, is relative. We all have different costs in our lives. So some people have student loans, some people have medical debt. And so it's important to note that just because somebody might be under the 30% threshold, it doesn't necessarily mean that housing is affordable or that they're living an affordable life. So I just wanted to note that. But ultimately, housing cost burden occurs anytime that their payments for housing is leaving insufficient funds for other necessities like food, healthcare, transportation. And so this is a real indicator of financial instability and ultimately risk. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition releases what's called an out of reach report on an annual basis. And so they look at the number of people within a particular area that are considered to be cost burdened or severely cost burdened. And so this is the breakdown for New Hampshire from the 2025 report. As you can see, those earning extremely low income, so that's no income up to 30% of the area median income, are the most cost burdened population. But you can also see that even middle income households, so those earning 1% and 100% of the area median income, still experience cost burden. And that falls around 20% of renter households. This is looking at renter households in particular. So you can see that it really occurs at all ends of the income spectrum and not just with extremely low income earners. This again is from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, and so they gave us a breakdown of what things look like in particular in Strafford County and Rockingham County. And as you can see, those this graph looks particularly at renters as well, rent and utility costs, and we see that nearly 50% of renters are paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs in New Hampshire. Renters are more likely to make lower incomes and face significant cost burden. And so you can see that those statistics really jump when you're looking at low income renters. More than 50% are paying more than 50% of their income towards housing costs in both Strafford County and in Rockingham County. And so high housing costs, when there are too many members of the workforce who are experiencing cost burden, that tends to lead to workforce shortages because these folks are not able to afford to live where they work. So this is obviously a big concern of ours as the Workforce Housing Coalition, and we really seek to better understand which sorts of businesses and which occupations are experiencing this most acutely. But just zooming out to the national level, again, the National Low Income Housing Coalition releases this report every year and shows that New Hampshire ranks 12th in the country for highest housing wage. So that means on average, a household has to be earning $35.08 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental home. A minimum wage worker needs to work 194 hours a week to afford the average 2-bedroom rental home. So that, I work 40 hours a week, sometimes up to 50, depending on what's going on. I cannot fathom working 194 hours a week. But any, minimum wage worker who is not working that is almost certainly experiencing housing cost burden. So what does that mean, for people and our communities and our businesses? The New Hampshire Housing recently released a report called "Who Can Afford to Live in New Hampshire," and it really breaks down certain occupations and the extent to which they can afford median rent in New Hampshire. And so we see occupations from fast food workers all the way to software developers. This is obviously not a comprehensive list, but it gives you sort of a sampling of the kind of occupations that exist in New Hampshire. And as you can see, most of these who are earning the median salary for that occupation cannot afford the median rent in New Hampshire. The two occupations on this list, as you can see, who can are registered nurses and software developers, but the rest cannot. And we think particularly of our school teachers, elementary school teachers. Not to say that this whole list isn't important, but when it comes to actually supporting our children, the development of our communities, those are really essential workers. We think of, the essential workers who were still required to work through the pandemic. These are the people that are being priced out and can't afford median rent in New Hampshire. So we understand sort of what's happening through the data. We also understand what's happening through storytelling. The Workforce Housing Coalition a few years ago created a series called Why Housing Matters, where we interviewed a number of employers in the region to understand their investment in the issue and why housing mattered to them. And almost universally, we came to understand that it was in some cases an existential threat to some of the businesses in our community. Their employees often would leave due to high housing costs. They had a difficult time attracting and retaining talent for their staff. And ultimately, it threatened the bottom line of their business. And we see this in businesses like On Target Fitness, all the way up to larger businesses, in the area that really depend on, workers for their survival, as most do. And so I won't play this right now, but I just wanted to point out that we have this amazing series that you can hear directly from businesses. And that is on our website if you'd like to check it out. The last outcome of high housing costs that I just want to briefly touch on is sprawl. So as we all know, people go where housing is most affordable, which often means far away from job centers, like the city of Portsmouth, for example. So we hear the term bedroom community a lot, which refers to a suburb or less densely populated city or town outside of an economic hub where housing is less expensive. So when folks live in bedroom communities and commute to job centers, this obviously leads to longer commutes, people being away from their families for longer periods of times, but it also leads to greater fuel emissions, more cars on the road, and of course, building more homes in undeveloped areas where it's less expensive to build. So there are a couple of studies and assessments that look at sprawl, look at commutes, and how where we're living versus where we're working in the region. Of course, living close to work allows for a shorter commute, more free time, But again, if housing is unaffordable, a person might have to live further away. So the Stratford Regional Planning Commission, along with all the planning commissions throughout the state, publish a regional housing needs assessment periodically. The last one came out in 2023. And part of that looked at commutes in our region and where folks were living versus where they were working. The mean travel time to work in their region of focus was 27.5 minutes in 2020. Of course, that varied pretty greatly by municipality. But the public outreach survey associated with this report found that 70% of respondents travel less than 30 minutes for work, childcare, or daily needs. However, residents of more rural areas, especially in northern communities, are much more likely to face longer commutes. And again, this really varies by municipality. In this region, Wakefield had the longest commute time of 40.8 minutes on average. And you can see that there's a difference in the amount of people who live in the region versus where they work. We want those numbers to be somewhat parallel, ideally. And we also, if you look at this, the graph on the map on the left, you can see just how far away some folks are living from where they work in the region. And again, we want that to be a little bit more densely populated and concentrated in that one area so that folks are living closer to their places of occupation. GIS Science and Remote Sensing has a study on sprawl in New England. I'm not going to pretend to understand the methodology or explain the methodology. If you want to go more into that, I would welcome you to. The authors essentially use decades of satellite data to map how built up areas like cities, towns, roads, and other impervious surfaces have spread in New England to estimate how much land has become paved or developed over time. So the key takeaway from this study shows that the greatest increase in urban area and impervious surfaces occurred along coastal zones. So where we are right now, coastal zones in southeastern New England, and also along major highway corridors. And there are a number of factors that lead to sprawl, but high housing costs is almost certainly one of the most prominent. So it's important to kind of consider how we got here in the first place. This did not just happen overnight. This is a long history of decision making and economic development that occurred over the decades. So I just want to take a moment to consider how we got here in this current situation. So many will say it's a tale as old as zoning laws. It's definitely not the only factor here, but today's housing crisis is largely driven by historic underproduction that we've experienced over the last several decades. And that can be attributed in large part to a housing supply that's been artificially suppressed by modern zoning regulations. And so I'm going to get more into that a little bit later. But I just wanted to briefly touch on the fact that zoning really is a modern tool. It was originally created, the first comprehensive zoning code was actually passed in New York City in 1916 and was originally created as a planning tool to help cities organize land use and minimize conflicts between neighboring properties. So at its core, zoning was designed to prevent problems before they arise by regulating key elements of the built environment. So that means height, how tall a building can be. That means setbacks, how far buildings must be from property lines. That means lot coverage, how much of a lot can be built on. And that also means use, what activities are allowed, residential, commercial, and industrial, and also number of units. So single family versus duplex, for example. And again, I'm going to get more into that later. But essentially, these rules really shape how cities grow, and what kinds of homes get built, how many get built, and where businesses can locate. The New Hampshire Zoning Atlas is an amazing tool that I would encourage all of you to check out. It really shows just how pervasive single-family housing is versus other kinds of housing in New Hampshire. And so their visual summary notes that single-family housing is allowed by right on 93% of New Hampshire's 3.6 million buildable acres. It is also allowed by public hearing on another 3%, and is prohibited on only 4% of buildable acreage. So you can see with this, through the orange on this map, just how permissive single family housing is. By contrast, we have multifamily zoning, and for all intents and purposes, we're going to use 5 or more family homes, so 5 or more units as the definition of multifamily zoning. But you can see how fewer areas there are that are actually able to accommodate multifamily zoning. So that in total is just about 50%. It is allowed by right, meaning there's no need to go through a conditional approval process on only 7.8%. And it is allowed through a public hearing process on 41.5% of buildable area in the state. So you can see, if we go back to this this first slide, just how the difference in what's allowed between single family zoning and multifamily zoning. The New Hampshire Zoning Atlas also covers a number of other data points, including minimum lot size, setbacks, minimum frontages, lot coverage, parking requirements, height requirements. I'm going to get into a little bit more of those in just a moment. But again, it's a great tool that I would encourage all of you to check out. So this has really resulted in, as I said, historic levels of underproduction over the last few decades. Up for Growth publishes a report periodically to estimate the levels of underproduction in each state. In 2022, they estimated that we were short 26,000 homes to accommodate our workforce and other community members. And so this is a retroactive look at our underproduction levels. And then New Hampshire Housing takes a forward look at the number of housing units that are needed to accommodate future growth. So they do this within the time period 2020 and 2030, and also between 2020 and 2040. And so you can see they look at the total number of households that are needed, and they also break it down by unit type. So both looking at owner households and renter households. As you can see, we need quite a few, and these levels are somewhat daunting, but we do further break these down, and I'll get to this later. We do further break these down by community, and that makes it feel a little bit more manageable in terms of the rate that we need to grow over these periods of time. But the key takeaway is that by 2040, we need to add a total of 88,395 units across the state. So what do we do? So though it's easy to look at those numbers and maybe panic a little bit, but we are really fortunate in New Hampshire and across the country to have experts who are working on this issue and really understand what is moving the needle towards remedying some of these challenges. In New Hampshire, we have what's called the Workforce Housing Law. This is fairly unique to this state, but essentially this law defines workforce housing units that are affordable to renter families of 3 who are earning 60% of the area median income, and owner families of 4 who are earning 100% of the area median income. So they actually define that. And again, that's, affordable is considered to be households that are spending no more than 30% of their income. So this law defines that. It also goes on to say that in every municipality that exercises the power to adopt land use ordinances and regulations, such ordinances and regulations shall provide reasonable and realistic opportunity for the development of workforce housing. It also goes on to say that the establishment of housing which is decent, safe, sanitary, and affordable to low and moderate income persons and families is in the best interest of each community and the state of New Hampshire and serves as a vital public need. Opportunity for development of housing shall not be prohibited or reasonably discouraged by use of municipal planning and zoning powers. So again, we break down the number of units that are needed by a certain time period by community. And so while this workforce housing law really enables municipalities to reform their zoning in order to accommodate more housing in their communities for their workforce and low-income families, we see that the regional housing needs assessment again kind of breaks it down for us by community. So in Durham, where we are now, you can see that by 2040 we need to accommodate 771 units. That is considered to be the fair share for the community of Durham. And you can see it corresponds to the population. So a community like Madbury with a population of under 2,000 has a much lower fair share number. So these numbers obviously are a lot less daunting. This is a cumulative housing production target, and they create these targets for 2025, 2030, 2035, and 2040. So how do we do it? I always like to remind people that municipalities don't build housing, they make room for housing, and they can do that in a number of ways. There's no silver bullet when it comes to housing production. You really have to focus on the 5 L's of housing production, and we're not going to get into 4 of these, labor, land, lending, and lumber, but we are going to take a closer look at laws, which is something that municipalities really have the most control over on the local level. So the first housing friendly policy I want to touch on is to allow for more density, or in other words, more square footage of housing to be built on a given piece of land. So why does this matter? Higher density means that more homes can be created where infrastructure already exists. So that helps communities to meet demand without sprawling outward. So many of you might have seen this missing middle housing graphic, and this just shows all the different housing types aside from single family homes and big mid-rise apartments that can be created in communities if the zoning allows for it. A couple examples of this exist. New Hampshire doesn't have a statewide density bonus, but they do enable communities to create density bonuses. So New Hampshire's municipalities may only act pursuant of to a grant of power from the legislature, meaning that New Hampshire is not a home rule state, but the workforce housing law enables them to pass things like density bonuses. And in Durham, for example, the town's workforce housing ordinance provides a density bonus of 20%. So in other words, a developer can create 20% more units, market rate units, if 20% of the units of the project are designated for workforce housing. I should note that not all density bonuses are created equal, and very few have actually seen success. So municipalities right now are really looking at what can be done to make sure that density bonuses are working to incentivize the creation of workforce and affordable housing. We also see density policies on the local level. The city of Portsmouth just passed a co-living ordinance. So you think sort of dorms for adults. This is, housing where people have private sleeping units, but share common spaces like kitchens, bathrooms, common areas. And so this is now allowed in downtown Portsmouth and other certain zoning districts, and essentially just allows you to have more people in the same square footage that you would for a single family home. The second policy I want to touch on is reducing parking requirements. So parking requirements set the number of parking spaces a building must include, often based on the number of housing units or the size of each unit. More space for parking means less space for homes. And so it's really important to understand where where parking requirements might be able to be reduced in certain instances. We see this on both the state and local level. Again, SB 284 was just passed this summer, and it reduced on-site parking requirements for housing from 1.5 spaces to 1 space per unit. And then the city of Dover actually has no statutory parking requirements. So required parking is determined on a per case basis as part of the application process. So these policies both recognize sort of the burden that overly burdensome parking requirements really cause, and they were luckily passed and are helping to spur housing production across the state and in particular communities. The fourth one I want to touch on is lot sizes and setbacks. So minimum lot size rules say how much land is needed to build a home or other type of building. And setback rules mandate minimum distances for buildings from property lines, streets, or other features. So both really limit the number of homes that can be built if they are too large, and that makes it harder to create denser and therefore more affordable neighborhoods. So again, this is being focused on at both the state and local level. SB 84 is a piece of legislation that was introduced in the last legislative session that would establish maximum lot sizes for single family residential units based on the type of infrastructure servicing the lot, instead of allowing towns to require very large lot sizes across the board. So it ties the allowed lot size to the actual infrastructure capacity. That bill is being carried over and being studied in the upcoming session, and so will be revisited. But there are also already localities that have passed that have reduced their lot sizes and setbacks, one of which is the city of Keene, who passed an ordinance in 2023 reducing the minimum lot size in rural districts from 5 acres to 2 acres. The next one is allowing for all types of ADUs as opposed to be built by right as opposed to through conditional approval. And so ADUs are accessory dwelling units, sometimes known as granny units, that are located on the same property as the main home. And they can be attached like a basement apartment, or they can be detached like a backyard cottage. And why this matters is that ADUs add more homes without using more land. So they can help homeowners earn rental income. They also offer flexible living space for family members or caregivers, and it's a really great use of land that already exists and is already buildable. In this legislative session, an ADU law was passed to allow detached units by right in addition to attached units by right. The city of Somersworth was just a little bit ahead of the state legislation that passed, and they also allowed both attached and detached ADUs on any single family property, and passed that just before the state law was passed. And then finally, I just want to touch briefly on height restrictions. So height maximums set limits on how tall a building can be in different areas, and easing those height limits in key areas, in strategic areas, can support more homes while protecting community value. So this is an example from the city of New York. This is obviously not apples to apples, but you can see sort of conceptually how you might change height limits to both accommodate more housing, but also make it compatible with existing urban infrastructure. It is generally uncommon and bad practice for a state to impose universal height requirements, given the unique, character and nature of each municipality's built environment. So I did not put an example there. But for local policy, this town of Durham is looking into height maximums currently in the central business district. And they are considering increasing those height maximums from 3 to 4 stories by right and 5 stories by conditional use. So that's actually being looked at by the planning board tonight, and will continue to move through the local decision-making process to really understand if that is feasible and how that would help developers come in and potentially build more housing in the downtown. So what does the public think? All of those policies don't matter if they don't have pretty widespread support. And there are 3 studies that I just want to briefly touch on because I know we're coming up on time, that really demonstrate the importance of housing to folks, one of which is done by the University of New Hampshire. The 2025 Granite State poll once again found that housing is the top issue facing voters. 36% of voters cited it as a top issue, which is a notable increase from previous years, and it far exceeds the other problems that are important, but obviously housing is considered to be one of the most pressing. The St. Anselm College annual statewide survey of voter attitudes also shows that folks are really in support of more housing in their communities. They look at a number of factors. 78% of voters think that their communities need more affordable housing to be built. 62% want more affordable homes in their own neighbors, and 61% think that towns and cities should change land use regulations in order to allow more housing to be built. And so we can see between 2020 and 2025 that there's been sort of notable shifts in voter attitudes on this issue in the last 5 years. And then finally, Stay Work Play came out with a survey looking at a few different quality of life factors, but when it comes to housing, respondents were asked whether or not they believe that New Hampshire is worse or about the same as other places to live for affordable housing, and over 50% of all age groups and about 75% of 18 to 25-year-olds said that they think it's worse than other states. So these are people really starting their careers. Some of you might be on this call if you are an undergraduate student. So this is not a statistic that, entry-level employees or employers with entry-level jobs really want to see. So you can see this is really concerning for a whole swath of folks in the community. And the data continues to underscore just how important it is to focus in on these policies. So with that, I will end my presentation, and I believe we have about 9 minutes or so for questions that I'm happy to take.
The first question that we're going to tackle here comes from Stephen Bird, the director of the Carsey School. He's asking what's the reason for such a high prohibition rate on 5+ family units? Do you know who the typical opponent interest groups are and what their typical reasons are for opposing that?
That's a really great question. So that really stems from, New Hampshire had a pretty profound period of growth in the mid 1900s. And so zoning was originally used to manage that growth. It was a tool to manage the speed at which communities could grow. And so single family zoning really became a tool to do that. And it's for the same reasons that we see, today. People are concerned about school enrollment and what sort of pressures that more housing might put on the infrastructure and on municipal services. And what we're seeing today is those concerns are a little overinflated. In some cases, school enrollments are actually in decline across the state. And New Hampshire Housing actually has some great research on that as well that I would point to. But it really is a tool for, or was a tool and continues to be a tool for sort of stifling growth in a lot of ways. And as far as, opponents, I think, there's a large range of folks who might be invested in this issue. And, we hear from a lot of folks that they don't want the community character to change. Again, there are concerns about what sort of stresses that it might put on municipal services and infrastructure. And so all of these are really valid in a lot of ways. But what we're finding is that those arguments are often overinflated, and there are reasons to believe that housing will have a net positive at the end of the day. But it all, that really requires a community level analysis of what's going on to understand what a community can and should accommodate in terms of new housing growth.
Indeed. And so Molly asked a question to piggyback on that about density, and if there are any examples of towns that have successfully increased density despite all of these concerns. And you gave a few examples of what's going on in Portsmouth and Somersworth, but do you have any examples of towns that have really tackled this issue, increased density, and done so successfully?
Absolutely. Some of the examples that come to mind are Portsmouth, Dover, Somersworth, Rochester. Exeter has developed a little bit more density. But what I'll say is sometimes you can't actually see it. There are really creative ways of building more density into building existing buildings or land that maybe look like single family homes, but are actually duplexes or triplexes. So what I'll say is that density can be blended into a community, and you might not even know it. So it's maybe scary conceptually to think that there would be, more units, more building in a particular community. But with modern design and architecture, we can really blend it into communities really well. And so you might be walking around a community, including Durham, that has more density than you even know. And so a lot of communities across the Seacoast are working on that.
The town that I live in has done that. And so they look like single family homes, but actually they are now duplexes. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Molly asked a second question. Is there anything to help the single families or couples without children when it comes to affordable housing?
It's, again, a supply demand issue. So we really just want to see more supply so that we can meet the demand and that prices come down. And so we hope that by bringing prices down, it helps everyone across the board, regardless of your income level and regardless of whether or not you have children. I think while we're the Workforce Housing Coalition, we really seek to improve housing conditions for everyone, regardless of the situation. But part of that too is increasing home ownership opportunities and making that more affordable for folks. I didn't get too much into that, but there are a lot of ways that we're thinking about how to do that as well. And New Hampshire Housing also has some great resources on that.
Terrific. Thank you. So if there was one policy change that you could make, snapping your fingers, what would it be?
Yeah, I've been asked this before, and it's an impossible question to answer because, like I said, there's no silver bullet, and all of these things really need to be working in conjunction. And also, it's not a one-size-fits-all model. Each municipality really needs to be looking at what works for them. There are some universally good policies like the ones that I just touched on, but they really need to be looked at carefully. So Durham is a great example. Where can we add some modest height to our downtown to create a little bit more space for housing where it's not going to infringe on, any neighboring single family homes. And so they're doing a really great job in thinking through that. There's no single policy that will, solve our housing crisis, unfortunately. But I would say, taking that customized approach and really working through a community-driven process is the way to go in every community.
Terrific. Okay, a question from Tricia Boucher, who's our wonderful librarian at UNH. What to do about the very expensive condos being built? Happy for more dense housing, but between the cost and the condo fees, they really aren't an affordable option.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Like I said, the density bonuses that we're seeing, a lot of them have not worked the way that they were intended to work. And so they're not actually incentivizing developers to include more affordable units in their developments. So municipalities really need to be looking at how those density bonuses are constructed. They also need to be looking at other financing tools. That's something I didn't really get into in this presentation, but there are other ways to incentivize the creation of more affordable units. And I don't want to get too far into that. But again, it is there's no one size fits all model, and it really requires a municipality to look carefully at the resources they have available, the land they have available, and what might work to incentivize more affordable units while not deterring development, because we don't want to do that either.
Okay, great. So thank you again, Emmy. This was so informative. I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes. And I'm sure that all of our attendees learned a lot. Thank you all for joining us this morning and for your comments and questions in the chat. These slides will be posted as well as the recording on the Carsey Policy Hour website. So if you had to miss a part of the discussion this morning while you were making your coffee, go back to our website and check out the full video recording. And thank you for joining us. We will check back on January 14th for a Carsey Policy Hour session at 8 a.m. So I will see you all then. Happy holidays to you all. And thank you again.